She thought he was just another drifter passing through. He thought she was just another waitress struggling to get by. But when the undercover millionaire overhears her sobbing in the kitchen, he steps into a world of secrets, danger, and redemption, one that will change both of their lives forever. The diner smelled of coffee, grilled bacon, and something faintly burnt, the kind of aroma that lingered in places where people came to forget the world for a little while. Jeremy Carter sat at the counter, stirring a cup of black coffee that had been poured a little too carelessly, leaving a dark ring on the laminated surface. He was used to polished glass desks, expensive coffee brewed by machines that probably cost more than this entire establishment, and yet, as he sat there in his worn-out jeans and simple plaid shirt, he felt more in tune with the world than he had in years. The place wasn't remarkable, just another small-town diner on the edge of a highway, the kind of spot that hadn't changed much since the 60s. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a tired radio played old country songs in the background, and a handful of locals occupied their usual booths, sipping coffee as if they had nowhere else to be. He blended in easily, just another drifter passing through, no one suspecting that he was the man who owned not only this diner, but an entire empire of high-end restaurants. It had been years since he set foot in one of his own small businesses, but something had compelled him to stop tonight. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was restlessness, maybe it was something he hadn't quite put a name to yet. His gaze followed the waitress as she moved between tables, balancing plates with a kind of practiced exhaustion. She was younger than he expected, maybe late 20s, with tired eyes and a quiet grace that made her stand out in a place like this. Her uniform was neatly pressed but slightly worn, her dark hair pulled into a ponytail with a few strands falling loose around her face. She smiled at customers when they spoke to her, but it never quite reached her eyes. He had seen people like her before, people carrying invisible weights they never talked about. Lily Parker. He had read her name on the employee records before coming here, but a name on a piece of paper told him nothing about the real person behind it. She disappeared into the kitchen, pushing through the swinging door, and just as it swung shut behind her, Jeremy heard it, a quiet, muffled sound, barely audible over the clatter of dishes and the sizzling of a grill. At first, he thought he had imagined it, but then it came again, a sharp intake of breath, the kind someone takes when they're trying too hard to hold something back. Crying. Jeremy straightened in his seat, fingers tightening around the handle of his cup. He wasn't sure why it unsettled him so much, but it did. He had witnessed plenty of people break under pressure before, seen employees crumble after long hours and impossible expectations. But this was different. This was personal. He hesitated for only a moment before getting up, pushing his way through the swinging door as if he belonged there. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with the scent of grease and dish soap. A single overhead light flickered, casting a dim glow over stainless steel counters. Lily stood near the back, her back to him, one hand gripping the edge of a sink while the other pressed a phone to her ear. Her shoulders were tense, her body rigid, as if bracing for impact. "I told you, Jason, I don't have it," she whispered harshly, her voice raw with something close to desperation. "I barely have enough to keep a roof over our heads. You can't do this to me." Jeremy didn't move, didn't make a sound, but something inside him twisted at the way she spoke. A long silence, then a barely audible, "Please." She was begging. Before he could decide whether to turn back or make his presence known, Lily wiped at her face roughly, straightened her shoulders, and ended the call with a quick, decisive tap. She turned and froze when she saw him standing there. For a split second, she looked defenseless, caught in a moment of vulnerability she hadn't meant for anyone to witness. Then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. "You're not supposed to be back here," she said, voice steadier than before, though her eyes were still red-rimmed. Jeremy shrugged, leaning casually against the counter, though his mind was still processing what he had just overheard. "Figured I'd check if everything was okay." "Everything's fine." The words came too fast, too practiced. "Didn't sound fine," he said, watching her carefully. She exhaled sharply, as if he was just another problem she didn't have time to deal with. "Look, I don't know who you are or why you care, but I don't need help." That, Jeremy realized, was a lie. Still, he didn't push. He had learned long ago that some people fought harder when they felt cornered, and Lily was definitely a fighter. "Fair enough," he said easily, pushing away from the counter. "But if you ever do need help, You might want to consider letting someone in." She didn't respond, just watched him with an unreadable expression as he walked back into the main dining area. Jeremy sat back down at the counter, his mind still turning. He had come here expecting to observe, to learn about the business from the ground level, but he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to care. The cook behind the grill, a man in his 60s with a stained apron and a permanent frown, glanced at him. "She's a tough one," he muttered, flipping a pancake with a practiced flick of the wrist. Jeremy looked at the kitchen door again, then back at his coffee. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I can see that." He should have left it alone. He should have finished his coffee, paid his bill, and walked away. But something about the way Lily had whispered that one word, "please," lodged itself into his mind like a splinter he couldn't ignore. He had spent years making deals, negotiating contracts, deciding the fate of businesses with a single signature. He had built an empire from nothing, turned failing restaurants into global successes. And yet, sitting in that diner, watching a waitress fight battles no one seemed to notice, he felt like he had never been more out of his depth. Lily Parker was drowning, and for reasons he didn't fully understand yet, Jeremy Carter had no intention of letting her sink. What would you do if you discovered your boss was a secret millionaire? Do you think Jeremy did the right thing stepping in to help Lily? Let us know in the comments. And if you're hooked on this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Jeremy returned to the diner the next morning before the sun had fully risen, the neon sign in the window still flickering like it couldn't quite decide if it wanted to work or not. The place was quieter than the night before, only a handful of customers sitting at the counter nursing steaming cups of coffee, their faces still heavy with sleep. He took a seat in the farthest booth, positioning himself where he could see everything without drawing too much attention. It wasn't just curiosity that brought him back, though he told himself it was. There was something unfinished about last night. Something about Lily's hollow expression that had unsettled him in a way he wasn't used to. He had spent years learning to read people, to recognize desperation disguised as strength, and she had worn that mask almost too well. Lily moved through the diner with the same quiet efficiency as before, balancing plates and refilling coffee cups, her steps precise but tired. He could tell she hadn't slept much. The purple shadows beneath her eyes were more pronounced in the morning light, and she carried herself with the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than just physical fatigue. Yet she still smiled at the customers, still made small talk with the older couple in the corner, still acted as if nothing in her world was crumbling. Jeremy watched as she pulled out a small notepad from her apron and made a few quick calculations, her lips pressing into a thin line as she totaled her tips from last night. Whatever the number was, it wasn't good. She exhaled sharply, folding the bills carefully and tucking them away. Frank, the manager, emerged from the back office a few minutes later, a clipboard in hand, his presence shifting the atmosphere of the room in an instant. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, whose authority came not from respect, but from the way he made people feel small. Jeremy had known men like him before, men who mistook fear for power, who wore their cruelty like a badge of honor. Frank glanced around the diner with the kind of expression that said he was looking for something to be dissatisfied with, his gaze landing on Lily. "You're late," he said, even though she clearly wasn't. Lily barely reacted, just kept wiping down the counter with slow, deliberate movements. "I clocked in 5 minutes early," she said evenly, not looking up. Frank scoffed. "Yeah? Well, maybe you should have come in 10 minutes early. Place looks like a mess." Jeremy's grip on his coffee cup tightened. The diner was spotless. Lily didn't argue. She just nodded once, picked up a tray, and moved to clear the empty plates left behind at one of the booths. Jeremy watched the exchange carefully, saw the way Frank's eyes followed her like a predator waiting for an excuse. He had seen this before, too. The way power corrupted, how small men made themselves feel bigger by crushing the people beneath them. Jeremy knew, in theory, that he could put an end to this with a single phone call. He could fire Frank, restructure the entire place, triple Lily's salary overnight if he wanted to. But he had learned long ago that throwing money at a problem didn't always fix it. He needed to understand the full scope of what was happening here first. Lily passed by his table a few minutes later, setting down a plate of eggs and toast without looking at him. "Didn't peg you for the type to come to a place like this 2 days in a row," she said, tucking her notepad back into her apron. Jeremy shrugged. Figured I'd try the breakfast. Her mouth twitched, like she wanted to smile, but didn't quite have the energy. Hope you like it greasy. She turned before he could say anything else, disappearing behind the counter again. He watched as she worked, the rhythm of the diner moving around her, the weight of whatever she was carrying pressing into her shoulders. She was good at pretending she wasn't drowning, but Jeremy could see it. He could see it in the way she hesitated before checking her phone, the way she clenched her jaw when she looked at her tips, the way she never quite met Frank's eyes. An hour later, Lily took her break, slipping into the booth across from Jeremy without asking, her coffee cup cradled between her hands. "All right, mystery man," she said, stretching her legs beneath the table. "What's your deal?" Jeremy raised an eyebrow. "My deal?" She gestured toward him vaguely. "Guys like you don't just wander into diners like this for the ambience." He smirked. "What kind of guy do you think I am?" "The kind who doesn't belong here." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You don't talk like a drifter. You don't look like you've spent your life hopping between small towns. But you're here, and I can't figure out why." He leaned back in his seat, letting the silence stretch between them for a moment before he finally said, "Maybe I just like to watch people." Lily snorted. That sounded a little creepy. Jeremy chuckled. "You know what I mean. Some people come to places like this to escape. Others come to see what they've been missing." She considered that for a moment, tapping her fingers against the ceramic of her mug. "And which one are you?" He hesitated before answering. "I don't know yet." Lily didn't push for more, just exhaled quietly and took another sip of her coffee. "Well, whatever it is, you should be careful about getting too comfortable here." "Why's that?" She glanced toward Frank, who was barking orders at one of the younger waitresses. "This place has a way of keeping people stuck." Jeremy watched her, something in his chest tightening at the way she said it. Like she had once believed she could get out, but had long since accepted that she never would. Lily's phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at the screen before sighing and rubbing a hand over her face. Jeremy caught a glimpse of the name before she turned it over. "Jason." She caught him looking and gave him a tight smile. "X," she said simply. "The kind that doesn't understand what no means." Jeremy frowned. "You need me to?" "No." She cut him off before he could finish. "I can handle it." But Jeremy wasn't sure that was true. She drained the last of her coffee and slid out of the booth. "Thanks for the company," she said, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the table for her part of the meal. "Don't stick around too long, Eli. Some places aren't meant for second chances." She walked away before he could respond, disappearing back into the kitchen. Jeremy stared after her, the words lingering longer than they should have. He wasn't sure what exactly he had been looking for when he walked into this place the night before, but now he knew one thing for certain. Lily Parker was fighting a battle no one else seemed to notice. And Jeremy Carter wasn't the kind of man who could just walk away. Jeremy hadn't planned on staying. That was the part that bothered him the most. He had come to this town expecting to spend a single night in the diner, observing, absorbing, then moving on like he always did. But something about Lily Parker made it impossible to leave. Maybe it was the way she carried herself as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders, or maybe it was the way she fought to keep standing, even when the ground beneath her was crumbling. He had seen desperation before, had witnessed it in the business world when men lost everything and clawed at whatever scraps were left. But this was different. This wasn't about greed or ambition. This was survival. He returned to the diner that evening, taking a seat at the same booth near the window, and watched as the night shift unfolded. The rhythm was the same. Orders shouted over the counter, coffee cups refilled without a second thought, the occasional burst of laughter from the older customers who had been coming here long enough to know every crack in the floor. Lily moved through it all like a ghost, her smile practiced but hollow, her hands steady even when her eyes weren't. Jeremy hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but the diner was small, and voices carried. He caught snippets of conversations as Lily interacted with the other employees, each exchange revealing more than she probably realized. "Rent's due tomorrow," one of the younger waitresses whispered as Lily counted her tips again, her fingers tightening around the small stack of bills. "You good?" Lily nodded, too quickly. "Yeah, I'll figure it out." The girl hesitated before walking away, and Jeremy saw it then, the moment Lily let the mask slip. It was only for a second, a brief flicker of something raw in her expression before she shoved the bills into her apron and forced herself to keep moving. Jeremy's jaw clenched. He had built his entire career on numbers, calculations, investments that always yielded results. But none of those numbers had ever been this small, this crucial. He knew, without even needing to ask, that Lily Parker was living paycheck to paycheck, that she was fighting to keep herself above water while everyone around her barely noticed she was drowning. Frank emerged from the back office not long after, his presence as unwelcome as ever. The way he carried himself, shoulders squared, chest puffed, reminded Jeremy of men he had dealt with before, middle management types who reveled in whatever little power they had, who controlled the weak because it was the only thing that made them feel strong. "Lily," Frank called out, his voice sharp enough to cut through the clatter of dishes. "We need to talk." She barely glanced at him. "Little busy here, Frank." "Now." Jeremy watched as she exhaled slowly, pressing her lips together before setting down the coffee pot and following Frank toward the back office. He shouldn't have cared. He shouldn't have followed. But he did. The office door wasn't fully closed, and Jeremy positioned himself just far enough away that he could hear without being noticed. "You're short again this month," Frank said, his tone laced with something close to amusement. "That's 3 months in a row, Parker." Lily's voice was steady, but Jeremy could hear the exhaustion beneath it. "I told you, I'll pay you by Friday." Frank chuckled, a sound that made Jeremy's hands curl into fists. "That's what you said last time. I just need a little more time. You know how this works, Lily. You want to keep your job, you pay what you owe." Jeremy stiffened. He had assumed Frank was just an overbearing boss, the kind who enjoyed making his employees miserable. But this was something else. Lily didn't say anything for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower. "I don't have it right now." Frank sighed, the kind of exaggerated sigh that let everyone know he was in control. "Then I guess we have a problem." Jeremy had heard enough. He pushed open the office door without bothering to knock, stepping inside as both Lily and Frank turned to face him. Lily's eyes widened slightly, a flash of surprise before she masked it. Frank, on the other hand, just looked annoyed. "This isn't your concern," Frank said, folding his arms. "Seems like it is," Jeremy replied smoothly, leaning against the doorframe. "Unless you want to explain why you're extorting your own employees." Frank scoffed. "Extorting? That's a big word for a guy who just washes dishes around here." Jeremy's gaze flickered to Lily, who was watching him carefully, as if trying to figure out what the hell he was doing. He wasn't entirely sure himself, but one thing was clear: Frank wasn't just a bad boss. He was something worse. Frank straightened, stepping closer, his expression smug. "She owes me," he said, jerking his thumb toward Lily. "That's how it works. You want to keep a job, you pay your debts. Ain't that right, Parker?" Lily's hands curled into fists at her sides, her jaw tightening. "You don't get to. I'll cover it," Jeremy said before he could stop himself. Lily's head snapped toward him. "What?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? You planning on playing hero now?" Jeremy didn't even blink. "How much does she owe?" Lily grabbed his arm before Frank could answer, her grip surprisingly strong. "No," she hissed, her voice low. "I don't need your help." Jeremy met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Seems like you do." She swallowed hard, her nails digging into his sleeve before she let go, stepping back. "This isn't your problem, Eli." Frank was grinning now, clearly enjoying the show. "Looks like your little friend here doesn't want your charity." Jeremy's patience was wearing thin. He stepped closer to Frank, lowering his voice just enough that only the other man could hear. "You have 2 choices. You take the money and shut your mouth, or I make sure you never work in this business again." Frank's smug expression faltered, just for a second. Jeremy had spent years making powerful men nervous. He had learned that the best way to win wasn't by raising his voice or making threats. It was by making sure they knew he meant every word he said. Frank cleared his throat, glancing toward Lily, then back at Jeremy. "Fine," he muttered. "She's clear. But this ain't gonna be a regular thing." Jeremy didn't answer. He just turned, catching Lily's gaze as he walked past her. She didn't say anything as he left the office, but he could feel the weight of her stare, the way her entire body was tense, as if she was caught between anger and something else. Jeremy returned to his booth, his coffee now cold, his appetite gone. He had done what needed to be done, but he knew this wasn't over. Lily wasn't the kind of woman who accepted help easily, and something told him she wasn't going to let this go. A few minutes later, She slid into the seat across from him, her expression unreadable. You had no right to do that. Probably not. She exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over her face. You don't understand how things work around here. Then explain it to me. She stared at him for a long moment, her jaw clenched. People like me don't get saved, Eli. Jeremy leaned forward, his voice softer now. Maybe they should. She didn't respond, just looked away, staring out the window as the neon sign flickered again. Jeremy knew, in that moment, that he wasn't leaving this town anytime soon. Jeremy didn't sleep that night. He lay on the stiff mattress of the small motel room he had rented, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the look in Lily's eyes when she told him people like her didn't get saved. He had spent his entire life navigating high-stakes business deals, cutting through negotiations with precision, but nothing had ever left him feeling quite as unsettled as that single sentence. He had built an empire from the ground up, made decisions that changed the course of industries. Yet here he was, unable to shake the weight of one woman's struggle. Morning came too soon, the dim glow of the rising sun seeping through the cheap blinds as he got dressed. He walked to the diner, the air crisp, the streets quiet in the early hour. The place wasn't officially open yet, but through the large front window, he could see Lily inside, wiping down the counters, setting up for the day before anyone else arrived. She looked different this morning, more tired than usual, if that was even possible. He pushed the door open, the small bell above jingling as he stepped inside. Lily didn't look up, just kept scrubbing the same spot on the counter, her movements slow and deliberate. You're here early, Jeremy said, slipping onto a stool. Lily finally glanced at him, her expression unreadable. So are you? Couldn't sleep. She snorted softly, shaking her head. Welcome to my world. There was something in her voice, something distant. Jeremy studied her carefully, noticing the way she avoided meeting his gaze for too long, the way her fingers tightened around the cloth in her hands. You gonna tell me what's really going on? He asked after a moment. Lily exhaled sharply, tossing the rag onto the counter and finally looking at him. Why do you care? Jeremy considered that for a second. He had asked himself the same question more times than he could count. Maybe it was because he had always prided himself on fixing things, on finding solutions to impossible problems. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he wasn't quite ready to admit. Because I do, he said simply. Lily let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. You want to know what's really going on, Eli? Fine. I work 16-hour shifts in a place that barely pays me enough to keep the lights on. I have a little brother at home who depends on me for everything, and an ex who won't stop finding new ways to screw me over. I owe more money than I can keep track of, and the only reason I haven't drowned yet is because I'm too stubborn to let it happen. That's what's going on. Jeremy felt something in his chest tighten. He had suspected as much, but hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way that hit harder than he expected. Your brother, he said carefully. How old is he? Lily hesitated, then sighed. Noah just turned 10. Jeremy nodded slowly, trying to picture what that must have been like. Raising a child alone, working herself to exhaustion just to survive. It explained the way she carried herself, the constant weight on her shoulders. And your ex? He asked. Jason. Her expression darkened. He was gone for a while. Now he's back, acting like I owe him something. Keeps threatening to take Noah from me if I don't pay him what he thinks he's entitled to. Jeremy's jaw clenched. Entitled to what? Lily let out a bitter laugh. To whatever he can squeeze out of me. He knows I won't risk losing Noah, so he keeps pushing. Calls, texts, showing up at my apartment when he feels like it. He's a parasite, one I can't seem to get rid of. Jeremy leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Have you gone to the police? She shook her head. And tell them what? That my deadbeat ex is harassing me? That he keeps making empty threats? They won't do anything until it's too late. Jeremy could hear the frustration in her voice, the quiet resignation of someone who had been fighting a battle alone for far too long. He wanted to tell her she wasn't alone anymore, but he knew she wouldn't believe him. Not yet. Instead, he said, what if you didn't have to fight this on your own? Lily narrowed her eyes. And what's that supposed to mean? It means maybe it's time to stop playing defense. She studied him for a long moment, then sighed, shaking her head. You don't get it. Jason doesn't just want money. He wants control. If I fight back, he'll make my life hell in ways I can't afford. I don't get to win this fight, Eli. I just survive it. Jeremy leaned back in his seat, watching her carefully. He had spent years negotiating with sharks, dismantling corporations that thought they were untouchable. Jason was nothing more than another man who mistook fear for power. And Jeremy had never lost to men like that before. He just had to convince Lily to let him help. The diner started filling up soon after, the quiet morning replaced with the usual chaos of the breakfast rush. Lily slipped back into work mode, moving between tables with practiced ease, but Jeremy could see the tension in her movements, the way her shoulders remained stiff, the way she glanced at her phone every time it buzzed. Frank hovered near the entrance, watching her in that way that made Jeremy's blood boil. But it wasn't just Frank anymore. Now there was Jason, a man Jeremy had yet to meet but already despised. He needed to see the full picture. He needed to know what he was up against. By the time the lunch rush had settled and the diner quieted again, Jeremy had made his decision. He stood, tossing a few bills onto the counter before looking at Lily. "I'll see you later." She frowned slightly. "You leaving town?" "Not yet." She studied him for a second, then shook her head. "You should. Some things aren't worth getting involved in." Jeremy smirked. "I'll take my chances." Lily sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "You're impossible. I've been told." She shook her head again, but there was something else in her expression now, something almost unreadable. "Be careful, Eli." Jeremy didn't respond. He just nodded once before stepping out into the afternoon sun, already planning his next move. Because Lily Parker might have accepted that some fights couldn't be won. But Jeremy Carter had never believed in losing. Jeremy spent the next few days watching, listening, waiting. He wasn't a man who acted without a plan, and Lily's situation wasn't something he could charge into without understanding every angle. He needed to know just how deep Frank's control over the diner ran, how much power Jason thought he had, and most importantly, what Lily wasn't telling him. Because there was more. There always was. He had spent years learning how to read people, how to spot the cracks beneath the surface, and Lily had plenty of them, no matter how hard she tried to hide them. Frank was predictable. He had the kind of authority that existed only because no one had challenged it, the kind of power that crumbled the second someone with actual strength stood up against him. He bullied because he could, because he had gotten away with it for so long that it had become second nature. He docked pay for minor infractions, cut corners where he could, and made sure no one felt safe enough to fight back. But Frank didn't worry Jeremy. Men like Frank always thought they were untouchable, right up until the moment they realized they weren't. Jason, on the other hand, was different. The first time Jeremy saw him was 2 days after his conversation with Lily, when Jason showed up outside the diner just as the sun was setting. He leaned against the hood of an old car, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the entrance like he was waiting for something. Or someone. Jeremy knew Lily was still inside, finishing up for the night, and he also knew that she had been checking her phone every few minutes, her tension growing with each passing second. Jason looked exactly like the kind of man Jeremy had expected, lean, with sharp, narrow eyes and a smirk that spoke of a lifetime of getting away with things he shouldn't have. He was the type that thrived on intimidation, that knew just how far he could push without crossing the line into something that would land him in a jail cell. Jeremy had dealt with men like him before. They were all the same. When Lily finally stepped outside, Jason straightened, pushing off the car with the kind of ease that made it clear he expected her to come to him. She hesitated, just for a second, and Jeremy saw it. The flicker of something close to fear before she forced herself to move forward. He couldn't hear what they were saying from where he stood, but he could read the body language. Jason leaning in too close, smiling in that slow, deliberate way that wasn't friendly at all. Lily stiffening, arms crossed over her chest, her weight shifting like she was bracing herself for something. She wasn't scared, not exactly, but she wasn't comfortable either, and she sure as hell wasn't happy. Jeremy moved before he could think better of it. He crossed the parking lot with slow, measured steps, making sure Jason saw him coming before he spoke. "Everything all right here?" Jason turned, his smirk widening as he looked Jeremy over, sizing him up. "Who the hell are you?" Jeremy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "A customer." Jason snorted, shaking his head. "A customer, huh? You always make a habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." "Only when I don't like what I see." Lily shot Jeremy a warning look, but he ignored it. Jason's smirk didn't fade, but there was something in his eyes now, something calculating. "Relax, man. Just having a friendly chat with my girl. Not your girl, Lily muttered. Jason's jaw tensed, just for a second, but his smile didn't slip. Come on, sweetheart. No need to be like that. Jeremy took a step closer, just enough to make sure Jason knew he wasn't backing down. Seems like she's already told you where she stands. Jason's eyes flicked between Jeremy and Lily before he let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. I get it now. You think you're her knight in shining armor or something. That's cute. Jeremy didn't rise to the bait. He had spent too many years dealing with men who thought they were clever to let Jason get under his skin. Instead, he just tilted his head slightly, studying the other man the same way he would study a new competitor before dismantling their entire business. You're in her way. Jason's smirk faded, just a little. Lily, clearly fed up, stepped between them, glaring at both of them. Enough. Jason, go home. Jason held her gaze for a long moment before exhaling sharply, shaking his head. You're making a mistake, Lily. Pretty sure I'm not. Jason didn't argue. He just took a step back, giving Jeremy one last once-over before climbing into his car. The engine roared to life, and then he was gone, leaving behind the stench of cigarette smoke and bad intentions. Lily turned on Jeremy the second Jason was out of sight. What the hell was that? Jeremy raised an eyebrow. Looked like you needed backup. I don't need you fighting my battles. Didn't seem like you were winning that one. Her eyes flashed with something sharp, but instead of snapping back at him, she just exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over her face. You don't get it. Jason isn't just some ex who won't take a hint. He doesn't let things go. Jeremy leaned against the side of the diner, crossing his arms. Then it's time someone made him. She let out a bitter laugh. And you think that's you? I know how to deal with men like him. Lily shook her head. You don't know anything about him. Then tell me. She hesitated, looking away, and Jeremy knew she wouldn't. Not yet. She didn't trust him enough. And maybe she never would. Just stay out of it, Eli, she muttered, turning to leave. Jeremy let her go, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't staying out of it. Because Jason wasn't just a problem. He was a threat. And Jeremy had never been the kind of man to ignore a threat. The next morning, Jeremy arrived at the diner early again, just in time to see Frank chewing out one of the younger waitresses over something that didn't matter. He sat in his usual booth, watching, waiting, memorizing every little thing that went wrong in this place. He had spent his career turning failing businesses into something better, but this wasn't just about business anymore. Frank, Jason, the way Lily was barely holding it together. It was all connected, all tangled up in a mess she had been trying to fight through alone for too long. Jeremy wasn't a hero. He wasn't the kind of man who did things out of the goodness of his heart. But he also wasn't the kind of man who let things slide when he knew he could fix them. So he was going to fix this, even if Lily never forgave him for it. Jeremy had never been the type to second-guess himself. Every decision he had ever made, whether in business or in life, had been calculated, deliberate, and ultimately successful. But as he sat in his booth at the diner that morning, watching Lily move through her shift like a woman running on nothing but sheer willpower, he felt something he wasn't used to. Frustration. Not at her, but at the entire situation, at the way she carried herself like she had no choice but to bear the weight of the world alone, at the way Frank watched her with that smug sense of authority, and at the way Jason lurked at the edges of her life, waiting for his moment to strike. He was done waiting. The shift had barely started, and already Jeremy could tell something was wrong. Lily was slower than usual, her movements just a little off, her grip on the coffee pot trembling slightly as she poured refills for the regulars at the counter. She looked paler than normal, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and every so often, she would press a hand to her stomach as if trying to quell something. Frank, of course, noticed immediately. Pick up the pace, Parker, he barked from behind the counter, not even looking up from his clipboard. Or do I need to remind you how replaceable you are? Jeremy set down his coffee cup, his jaw tightening. Lily didn't react. She just nodded, muttered something under her breath, and kept moving. Jeremy could see how much effort it took, how she was forcing herself to stay upright, to pretend like she wasn't seconds away from collapsing. Then it happened. One moment, she was balancing a tray of plates, weaving through the diner with the kind of precision that came from years of experience. The next, her steps faltered, her knees buckled, and she crumpled to the floor. The tray crashed down beside her, plates shattering, silverware scattering across the tile. For a second, no one moved. The diner went completely silent, the kind of silence that only happened in the moments right before panic set in. Then Jeremy was out of his seat, moving toward her before he had even processed what he was doing. Lily. He crouched beside her, his hand reaching for her shoulder, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from her skin. Her breathing was shallow, her face damp with sweat. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, disoriented. I'm fine, she mumbled, trying to push herself up. The hell you are, Jeremy muttered, wrapping an arm around her to steady her as she tried to sit up. Frank finally decided to contribute something to the situation, stepping forward with a dramatic sigh. For God's sake, Parker, if you're going to pass out, do it on your own time. You're making a mess. Jeremy's head snapped up so fast it was a miracle he didn't break something. He was on his feet in an instant, stepping toward Frank before he even realized what he was doing. Say that again, Jeremy said, his voice low, calm, deadly. Frank blinked, clearly not used to being challenged. What? You heard me. Frank huffed out a laugh, shaking his head. Look, buddy, I don't know what your deal is, but this ain't your concern. She knows the rules. If she can't keep up, she's out. Simple as that. Jeremy took another step forward, his body coiled tight, with something dangerously close to rage. She just collapsed, and your first instinct is to threaten her job? Frank scoffed. It's not a threat. It's reality. Jeremy wasn't sure what would have happened next if Lily hadn't weakly grabbed his wrist, her fingers barely managing to curl around his skin. Don't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. That one word was enough to pull him back, enough to remind him that losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to turn back to her. You need a doctor, he said, his tone softer now. She shook her head. I just need a minute. Lily, I can't afford to go to the hospital. She cut him off, her voice hoarse. Jeremy felt that hit like a physical blow. He could have covered her entire medical bill without even noticing the dent in his bank account. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she had been living like this for so long that she genuinely didn't see another option. Then at least let me take you home, he said, already knowing she was going to refuse. But this time, she didn't. She let him help her up, her body leaning against his for support, and Jeremy ignored the way Frank muttered something under his breath as he led her toward the exit. The entire diner was watching, but he didn't care. Lily's apartment was small, barely big enough for the essentials, but it was clean, organized, lived in. There were little touches of warmth, a framed picture of her and a young boy on the wall, a blanket draped over the couch, a well-worn cookbook resting on the counter. Noah. Jeremy helped her to the couch, ignoring her weak protests as he grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen. Drink, he ordered, handing it to her. She did, though her hands were still unsteady. You should rest, he said, watching as she sank further into the cushions. Can't, she murmured, already fighting to stay awake. Noah, he's at school, Jeremy said. And you're in no condition to do anything but sleep. She let out a slow breath, her body finally relaxing. You shouldn't be here. Too bad. She didn't argue after that. Within minutes, she was asleep, her breathing evening out, the tension in her face finally easing. Jeremy sat beside her for a long moment, watching the way exhaustion had carved itself into her features, the way her body had been pushed far past its limits. He had spent his entire career focused on numbers, on profits, on the next big deal. But sitting there, in that small apartment, watching the way Lily had fought to keep herself together, he realized something. Some things were worth more than money, and Lily Parker was one of them. He wasn't going to let her break, not if he had anything to say about it. Lily woke to the sound of muffled voices. Her head felt heavy, her limbs sluggish, as if she had been pulled from a sleep deeper than anything she had allowed herself in years. The room was dim, the golden glow of the late afternoon sun filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the walls. She sat up slowly, her body protesting the movement, and it took her a moment to realize she wasn't alone. In the kitchen, Jeremy stood by the counter, speaking in hushed tones to a young boy, Noah. He was still in his school uniform, his backpack slung over one shoulder, a wary expression on his face as he looked up at Jeremy. Lily blinked, her mind catching up to the scene in front of her. You're the guy from the diner, Noah said, crossing his arms over his chest, his small face set in a stubborn expression that looked far too much like Lily's. Jeremy smirked slightly. That's me. Noah glanced toward the couch, his gaze landing on Lily. Why's he here? Lily sighed, running a hand through her hair, still trying to shake off the lingering fatigue. Because I got sick at work. Noah frowned. You never get sick. Yeah, well, I guess it finally caught up with me. Noah didn't look convinced. He turned back to Jeremy, his eyes narrowing. Are you her boyfriend, or something? Jeremy let out a low chuckle. No. Good. Noah said, nodding to himself. She doesn't have time for one. Jeremy shot Lily an amused glance, but she just rolled her eyes. Thanks for that, kid. Noah shrugged, dropping his backpack onto the floor. Just saying. Jeremy leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Seems like you've got a lot of opinions. I do, Noah said simply. And I don't trust people easy. Lily sighed, rubbing her temples. Noah, no, he's got a point, Jeremy interrupted, his voice calm but firm. You shouldn't trust people easy. But I'm not here to cause trouble. Noah studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. Okay, but I'm watching you. Jeremy grinned. Fair enough. Lily let out a tired breath, sinking back into the couch. Great. My little brother has declared himself my bodyguard. This is exactly what I needed today. Noah didn't even blink. Someone has to do it. Jeremy chuckled, shaking his head. Smart kid. Noah seemed satisfied with that and wandered into the kitchen, pulling open the fridge like he owned the place. Jeremy turned back to Lily, his expression softening. You feeling any better? Not really, she admitted. But I don't have time to be sick. You also didn't have time to pass out in the middle of the diner. But here we are, Jeremy said dryly. Lily glared at him. But before she could snap back, there was a sharp knock at the door. Her entire body tensed, her breath catching in her throat. Noah froze, his hand still gripping the fridge handle. Jeremy's expression darkened immediately. The knock came again, harder this time. Lily, a voice called through the door. Jason. Noah's face went pale, his small hands clenching into fists. Lily shot Jeremy a warning look, silently telling him to stay out of it, before pushing herself up and moving toward the door. Her legs still felt weak, but she ignored it, focusing instead on keeping her expression blank as she unlocked the door and pulled it open just enough to face the man on the other side. Jason leaned against the doorframe, his usual smirk in place, but there was something sharp in his eyes, something calculating. Heard you took a little fall at work today, he said smoothly. Figured I'd check in on you. Lily didn't flinch. I'm fine. Jason tilted his head slightly, glancing over her shoulder. You got company? None of your business. Jason let out a low chuckle. Come on, sweetheart, don't be like that. Don't call me that, Lily said, her voice ice cold. Jason's smirk twitched, just for a second, before he masked it. Relax. I'm just here to talk. Lily didn't move, blocking the doorway, refusing to give him the satisfaction of stepping inside. Then talk. Jason sighed, rubbing the back of his neck like he was tired of the conversation already. Look, I don't want to fight with you, okay? But you know how this works. You owe me. Lily's nails dug into her palms. I don't owe you anything. Jason leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You really want to test that? Before Lily could respond, a shadow moved behind her, and suddenly Jeremy was there, standing at her side, his presence solid and unshakable. Jason's smirk vanished. Jeremy tilted his head, studying him with the kind of calm that made it clear he wasn't afraid. Problem here. Jason straightened, his jaw tightening. Who the hell are you? Lily could feel the tension in the air shift, the invisible battle of dominance playing out between them. Jeremy didn't break eye contact. Someone who doesn't like the way you're talking to her. Jason's lips pressed into a thin line. This doesn't concern you. It does now, Jeremy said, his voice even. So I'm going to give you one chance to walk away. Jason let out a low chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. You don't know what you're getting yourself into, buddy. Jeremy's smile didn't reach his eyes. I know exactly what I'm getting into. Question is, do you? Jason's jaw twitched, his hands clenching at his sides. But he wasn't stupid. He knew when he was outmatched, even if he hated admitting it. Finally, he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. Fine. Have it your way. But this ain't over, sweetheart, he said, his eyes locking onto Lily one last time before he turned and walked away. The moment he was gone, Lily slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking fingers. Silence filled the apartment. Noah's voice was small. Is he going to come back? Lily closed her eyes for a second before turning to face her little brother, forcing a small smile. Not if I can help it. Jeremy was still watching her, his expression unreadable. Lily exhaled, pressing her fingers to her temples. I told you to stay out of it. Jeremy shrugged. I ignored you. She let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. You have no idea what you just started. Jeremy's expression didn't change. Then tell me. Lily stared at him for a long moment, torn between frustration and something dangerously close to relief. She could push him away. She could tell him to leave and never come back. But deep down, she knew he wouldn't. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want him to. The air in the apartment felt thick, as if Jason's presence had left something behind, something invisible but suffocating. Lily sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers still gripping the fabric of her jeans, her breaths coming slow and measured as she tried to push back the rising wave of exhaustion and frustration. Noah had retreated to his room, the door left slightly ajar, but she knew he was still listening, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. Jeremy stood by the window, arms crossed, his expression unreadable as he stared out into the street, watching, waiting, assessing. You need to tell me everything, he said finally, his voice calm but firm. Lily let out a slow breath, shaking her head. It won't change anything. Maybe not, Jeremy admitted, turning to face her. But it'll help me understand how deep this goes. She hesitated, running a hand over her face, knowing there was no point in hiding anymore. He had already seen too much, had already forced his way into a part of her life she had spent years keeping locked away. Maybe it was time someone else knew. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling as she began. Jason and I met when I was 19. I was young, stupid, and desperate to get away from everything I thought was holding me down. He was charming, made me believe he actually cared about me. I thought I could build a life with him, that maybe, for once, I'd have someone in my corner. Jeremy didn't interrupt. He just listened, his gaze steady, his presence unwavering. But Jason was never interested in building a life with me. He was interested in control, in making sure I needed him more than he ever needed me. At first, it was small things, convincing me to leave school, to rely on him for money, to cut ties with anyone who might tell me he was bad news. And I let him. I let him because I thought love was supposed to be like that, supposed to be all-consuming. She swallowed hard, forcing down the bitterness that came with the memories. Then Noah was born, and everything changed. My mom had just passed. And suddenly, I was responsible for this tiny, helpless baby who had no one else. Jason didn't want him, didn't want the responsibility. He told me I had a choice, him or Noah. Jeremy's jaw clenched. You chose Noah. Lily let out a small, humorless laugh. There was never a choice. Silence stretched between them for a long moment before she continued. Jason left, disappeared for a few years, and I thought I was free. I worked, I struggled, but at least I was doing it on my own terms. Then, a few months ago, he came back. Said he wanted to fix things, to be part of my life again. But I know Jason. He doesn't care about me. He cares about what he thinks he's owed. Jeremy ran a hand over his jaw, exhaling slowly. He's using Noah against you. Lily nodded. Keeps threatening to take me to court. Says he'll fight for custody unless I pay him off. But he doesn't want Noah. He just wants leverage. And he knows I don't have the money to fight him. Jeremy's hands tightened into fists, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. He had known Jason was a problem, had known there was something more beneath the surface, but hearing it laid out like this made it feel all the more real, all the more infuriating. And Frank, he asked, already suspecting the answer. Lily hesitated, then sighed. He's been covering for Jason, letting him know when I work, making my shifts held just to remind me that I don't have options. I owe him money. Sure, but it's not just about that. He likes having power over me. Jeremy's mind was already working, already calculating the next steps. But before he could speak, Lily shook her head. I know what you're thinking, she said, her voice tired. And no, you can't fix this for me. Jeremy raised an eyebrow. Why not? Because men like Jason and Frank don't just disappear because you tell them to, she said, her voice firm but laced with something close to resignation. They dig in deeper. They find new ways to make your life hell. And if you come at them too hard, too fast, they retaliate. Jeremy studied her carefully, understanding what she wasn't saying. She wasn't just afraid for herself. She was afraid for Noah. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his tone measured. Lily, I don't lose. Not in business, not in life. And I sure as hell don't stand by and watch while people like Jason and Frank tear someone apart just because they can. She shook her head. This isn't business, Jeremy. This is my life. Then let me be part of it, he said, his voice low but filled with something undeniable. Lily swallowed hard, looking away. You don't know what you're asking for. I know exactly what I'm asking for, he countered. I'm asking you to trust me. She let out a slow, shuddering breath, rubbing her temples. You don't even know me. Jeremy smirked. I know enough. Lily sighed, standing up and pacing the small space of her living room, her mind warring with itself. She had spent so long fighting alone, had convinced herself that was the only way to survive. But Jeremy was different. He wasn't just offering help. He was offering something she had never had before, certainty. Before she could say anything, there was another knock at the door. This one was quieter, more hesitant. Lily's entire body tensed, and Jeremy was on his feet instantly. Noah poked his head out of his room, his eyes wide. Is it him again? Lily's throat felt tight as she approached the door, hesitating for only a second before unlocking it. It wasn't Jason. It was Sarah, one of the other waitresses from the diner. She looked nervous, glancing around before stepping inside quickly. You need to know something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily frowned. What's wrong? Sarah glanced at Jeremy, hesitating, but Lily nodded. It's fine. He's with me. Sarah let out a shaky breath. Frank knows who he is, she said, her eyes darting toward Jeremy. He figured it out this morning. He knows you're not just some guy off the street. Jeremy's expression didn't change. And Sarah swallowed. And he told Jason. The air in the room shifted, thick with something dark, something dangerous. Lily's heart pounded. What do you mean? Jason's pissed, Sarah whispered. He's saying he's going to make sure you regret ever getting involved with him. Frank's playing it off like a joke, but she shook her head. I don't think it is one. Jeremy was already reaching for his phone, his mind working a mile a minute. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. The moment he had been preparing for. Jason and Frank thought they could intimidate him, that they could scare him off like he was just another problem to be swept under the rug. They had no idea who they were dealing with. He turned to Lily, his expression unreadable. It's over, he said simply. This ends now. Lily's stomach twisted, fear and something else, something almost like relief, fighting for dominance in her chest. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't alone. And for the first time in his life, Jeremy Carter had found a fight worth losing sleep over. Jeremy had been in plenty of high-stakes situations before. He had walked into boardrooms knowing that millions, sometimes billions, were at risk. He had outmaneuvered men twice his age, had won battles before his opponents even realized a war had started. But this was different. This wasn't about money, about contracts or calculated risks. This was personal. Jason thought he was untouchable. Frank thought he could keep running things the way he always had. Neither of them had accounted for a man like Jeremy stepping into their world. Lily sat across from him at the small kitchen table, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the surface, her mind clearly elsewhere. Since Sarah had left, the weight of reality had settled over the apartment like a storm waiting to break. Jeremy could see it in the way her shoulders remained stiff, in the way her breath caught every time she glanced at the door as if expecting Jason to come barging in. We have to be smart about this, she said finally, her voice quieter than usual, but firm. Jeremy nodded. We will be. She exhaled slowly, lifting her gaze to meet his. You don't get it. Jason isn't just some deadbeat ex. He has connections. He knows how to manipulate people, how to twist things in his favor. And Frank, he's been running that diner like his own personal kingdom for years. You think you can just walk in and shut them down? Yes, Jeremy said simply. Lily let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. You make it sound so easy. It is. She frowned. And what if they push back? What if they come after you? Jeremy smirked. Then they'll regret it. Lily studied him for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing her temples. You're impossible. I've been told. A small, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of her lips, but it faded just as quickly. She sat back, folding her arms. So what's the plan? Jeremy leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Frank runs the diner, but he doesn't own it. Lily frowned. What do you mean? Jeremy's smirk widened slightly. I mean, I do. Silence. Lily blinked, her entire body going still. What? Jeremy exhaled, knowing there was no turning back now. I own the diner. The entire chain, actually. I bought it years ago when I was expanding into smaller markets. It was just another acquisition at the time, one I never paid much attention to. Lily's hands curled into fists. You're telling me you've owned that place this whole time? Yes. Her eyes burned with something close to betrayal. And you didn't think to mention that sooner? I wasn't sure how you'd react, Jeremy admitted. And I needed to see it for myself. How bad it had gotten. How deep Frank's corruption ran. Now I know. Lily pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. So this was all just research to you? No. Jeremy said quickly, standing as well. Lily, this isn't just business. If it were, I wouldn't still be here. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. I don't know if I should be pissed or grateful. Jeremy sighed. Maybe both. She let out a sharp breath, running a hand through her hair. So what now? You fire Frank and hope everything magically fixes itself. Jeremy's smirk returned, but this time, there was something sharper behind it. I don't hope for things, Lily. I make them happen. That night, Jeremy made his first call. Not to lawyers, not to board members, but to the right people. The kind who could ensure that when Frank walked into work tomorrow, it would be for the last time. By morning, the pieces were already moving. Frank arrived at the diner at his usual time, strolling in like he owned the place, barking orders at the employees before he had even taken off his coat. But something was different today. The air was charged, the usual weight of unspoken fear replaced with something else, anticipation. Lily was behind the counter, watching him carefully, her hands tightening around the rag she had been using to wipe the surface. She knew what was coming. Jeremy sat in his usual booth, sipping his coffee as he waited for the inevitable. Frank didn't notice him at first. He was too busy berating one of the newer waitresses for something insignificant. But then, as he turned, his eyes landed on Jeremy, and he frowned. You again, he muttered. Jeremy set down his coffee cup and stood. Morning, Frank. Frank's frown deepened. You got something to say? Jeremy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Actually, yeah, you're fired. Silence crashed over the diner like a tidal wave. Frank's face twisted in confusion, then amusement. What the hell are you talking about? Jeremy stepped forward, slipping a folded document from his jacket pocket and placing it on the counter. I own this place. And as of this morning, you don't work here anymore. Frank stared at the paper, his smirk flickering. You're bluffing. Jeremy tilted his head slightly. Am I? Frank snatched up the paper, his eyes scanning the official letterhead, the signatures at the bottom. His face went red. You son of a... Careful, Jeremy said, his tone mild but dangerous. Frank's hands clenched around the paper. You can't do this. I can, and I did, Jeremy said simply. You've stolen from my employees, threatened them, harassed them. You're lucky all I'm doing is firing you. Frank's mouth opened, then closed. He looked around, as if expecting someone to step in and defend him. But no one did. The employees who had once feared him now stood still, their gazes locked on Jeremy, on Lily, on the undeniable shift happening right before their eyes. Jeremy smirked. There's the door. Frank's jaw tightened, but he knew he had lost. He shoved the paper into his pocket, grabbed his coat, and stormed out without another word. The moment the door swung shut behind him, the diner erupted. Employees exchanged stunned glances, some whispering, others laughing in disbelief. It wasn't until Lily exhaled, her shoulders finally releasing the tension they had carried for so long, that the weight of it all truly settled. Jeremy turned to her. One down, he said. One to go. She let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. You don't mess around, do you? Jeremy smirked. Not when it matters. Lily's smile faltered slightly, something vulnerable flashing in her eyes before she masked it. Jason won't be as easy. Jeremy's expression darkened. Then it's a good thing I don't do easy. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Okay. Jeremy arched an eyebrow. Okay. Okay. She repeated, her voice stronger this time. He felt something settle in his chest, something solid and certain. This wasn't just about fixing a broken business anymore. This was about fixing what never should have been broken in the first place. And he wasn't stopping until it was done. Jeremy didn't waste time. With Frank out of the picture, the diner was finally under his full control, but that had only been the first battle. Jason was the real war. He knew men like Jason, knew how they operated, how they thrived on intimidation, how they wrapped their victims so tightly in fear that breaking free seemed impossible. But Jeremy had spent his life dismantling men who thought they were invincible, and Jason was no different. The only difference this time was that Jeremy wasn't doing it for business. He was doing it for Lily. The first sign of trouble came that evening. The diner had barely closed for the night when Lily's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated for only a moment before answering, pressing the phone to her ear with wary fingers. She didn't even get a chance to say hello before Jason's voice filled the receiver. "You think you won?" His voice was sharp, edged with barely contained fury. "You think because you got your rich boyfriend to fire Frank that this is over?" Lily closed her eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "What do you want, Jason?" A low chuckle, humorless and bitter. "You know what I want. And now, thanks to your little stunt, you owe me even more." Lily's stomach clenched. "I don't owe you anything. You keep telling yourself that, sweetheart. But we both know that's not how this works. You took away my easiest source of cash, and now I need compensation. You have a week." "A week for what?" "For the money, Lily. You think I'm just gonna let you humiliate me and walk away?" "I don't have that kind of money," she said, hating the way her voice shook just slightly. Jason exhaled, as if annoyed by her stupidity. "Then figure it out. You've got a week. After that, we're doing things my way." The line went dead. Lily lowered the phone slowly, her entire body cold. She knew what Jason's threats meant. If she didn't pay him, he'd find another way to make her suffer. And Noah, he'd use Noah against her without hesitation. Jeremy had been leaning against the counter, watching the entire exchange unfold. The second Lily set the phone down, he was beside her. "What did he say?" Lily shook her head, trying to steady herself. "He wants money." "How much?" Lily let out a sharp breath, rubbing her temples. "It doesn't matter. Even if I had it, giving it to him won't make him go away. He'll just come back for more." Jeremy's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure he can't come back." Lily scoffed. "And how do you plan on doing that? Call the cops?" "They won't do anything. Not unless he actually does something first." Jeremy exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to think. "He wants you to be scared. Wants you to feel like you don't have options." "That's because I don't," Lily said, frustration creeping into her tone. Jeremy turned to her fully, his voice quiet but firm. "You do now?" She let out a breath, shaking her head. "You can't just fix everything, Jeremy." "Why not?" "Because that's not how life works." Jeremy studied her, his eyes searching hers for something she wasn't ready to give. Finally, he stepped back, nodding once. "Then let's change the rules." The week passed faster than Lily had anticipated. She went through the motions, working, taking care of Noah, pretending like the weight of Jason's threats wasn't crushing her. But Jeremy was always there, watching, waiting, planning. She didn't know what he was up to, and honestly, she wasn't sure she wanted to. Then, on the sixth night, everything changed. She was walking home from the diner, her steps slow, her mind a mess of tangled thoughts, when she felt it, someone watching her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she quickened her pace, her breath hitching slightly. She barely made it to her apartment door before Jason stepped out of the shadows. "Going somewhere," he drawled, blocking her path. Lily's pulse skyrocketed, but she forced herself to stay still, to keep her expression unreadable. "Get out of my way, Jason." He smirked, but there was something darker behind it, something more dangerous. "You got my money?" She swallowed hard. "No." Jason sked, shaking his head. "That's disappointing. Really, Lily. I thought you were smarter than this." "I'm done playing your games," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Jason chuckled, stepping closer, invading her space. "Oh, sweetheart. We're just getting started." Lily's fingers twitched, debating whether she could shove past him, but before she could move, another voice cut through the air. "She told you to leave." Jason stiffened. "Jeremy." Lily turned just in time to see Jeremy step forward. His posture relaxed, but his eyes locked onto Jason with a look that promised destruction. Jason let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "Of course. The knight in shining armor. You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Jeremy smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't quit. I win." Jason's smirk faltered for just a second. "You think your money makes you untouchable?" Jeremy stepped closer, his voice dropping into something cold, lethal. "No. I think knowing exactly who to call, what to say, and how to destroy you makes me untouchable. Jason's confidence wavered, just slightly. Jeremy tilted his head, studying him like he was nothing more than a problem waiting to be solved. See, here's the thing. You're sloppy. You've got debts in more places than you can count. And you've got just enough enemies who'd love to see you taken down. So I made some calls. And let's just say, after tonight, you're not going to have much room to keep making threats. Jason's face darkened. You think you can scare me? Jeremy didn't blink. I think by tomorrow morning, you're going to be a very busy man dealing with things much bigger than me. Jason clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching like he wanted to swing. But he didn't. Because he knew. He knew Jeremy wasn't bluffing. Stay away from her, Jeremy continued, his voice quiet but sharp. Or next time, I won't just make phone calls. Jason glared at him, then at Lily. You really think this changes anything? Lily met his stare head on. Yeah, she said. I do. Jason exhaled sharply, his smirk finally cracking. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Lily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jeremy turned to her, his expression softening. You okay? She swallowed hard, nodding. Yeah. Jeremy didn't move, just kept watching her, waiting. And finally, after everything, she stepped closer, just enough to close the space between them. Thank you, she said quietly. Jeremy's lips quirked upward, but there was something serious in his gaze. Anytime. And for the first time in a long time, Lily believed him.